part of your work in the past has dealt with the subject of fluency and cognitive fluency. And in general, fluent tends to be better, but some of your work is counterintuitive. Adam, can you first begin by briefly explaining what fluency is and then sort of when it's good and when it's bad?
Yeah, sure. So cognitive fluency is basically how easy or difficult it is to make sense of any information in the world. It could be, imagine you're at the Oscars and you're announcing the winner. You've just opened the envelope, you're pulling out the name. There are names that are very easy to pronounce or to process, and then there are names that are much more difficult to process, perhaps foreign names you've never encountered before, things like that. And so this is the fluency dimension. It ranges from very, very fluent, something that's very easy to make sense of or process, to something that's very, very difficult or complex. And it's not just about names. It could be how easy it is to read font. So if you're making a font choice, is it easy to read the words that are written in that font, or is it difficult? It could be about the contrast between the foreground and the background. If I use black text on white background, that's easy to read. If I use light gray on a white background, much harder to read. It could be about things that are in memory. So things that you've said many times over the last few months are much more likely to be at the top of your mind. They will be more fluent or easy to draw from memory than things that you haven't thought of in years. So if you're trying to reconstruct an old memory, that will be more disfluent a process. And so fluency is this very domain general description of how easy or difficult any cognitive process is. Most of the time, as you say, it's a good thing to be fluent. If you're communicating with someone, you want them to understand you quickly. You don't want them to have to exert too much effort. If you're a product, you want people to immediately understand what you're selling. If you're in product marketing, you want them to hear the name of a book or the name of a product or the name of a person and to immediately say, yeah, I understand what that is. So fluency is generally by default a good thing, but there are times when disfluency is a good thing, when injecting a little bit of artificial complexity goes a long way. So if you think about the way humans function, most of the time we kind of bubble along, not thinking very deeply about what's in front of us. And that's because it's tiring. It takes up, first of all, a lot of calories, but also it's exhausting mentally for us to have to really deeply engage. That's why this concept of deep work, this idea you can only really do deep, intensive work for a few hours of the day, mentally at least, suggests that we have this limited capacity for deep thinking. And so our default is to go back to system one thinking, as it's called, or to think lightly or shallowly about things. And that happens when you experience fluency. Fluency is a sort of signal that everything in the world is fine. There's nothing to be alarmed about. You don't need to engage any extra resources. If you inject a bit of disfluency, so if I suddenly throw in a very difficult to pronounce word or a word you've never heard of before or something like that, or I stop and stutter for a second, that little burst of disfluency will cause you to go from that system one low-level processing to a higher level system two processing where you really engage much more deeply. And so we've got some evidence that if you want people to process something or pay attention to something more deeply, you actually want to make it slightly harder for them to make sense of, which is a little bit surprising to people. So if I ask you a question that I really want you to engage with, if I present it to you in a font like a standard 12-point Times New Roman font, you're less likely to engage with that question than if it's a little bit grayed out, a little bit italicized, maybe a little bit condensed, a bit harder to read. So complexity, disfluency is good when you want people to engage more. It's also good for signaling luxury. So if you think about luxury branding, a lot of the products we buy every day are easy for us to process. They tend to be brands that are from the country that we live in. And so we're familiar with the language that drove those names. But if you think about luxury branding, so if you're thinking about a luxury fashion brand, a lot of them are Italian or French. If you're thinking about luxury car brands, again, you've got a lot of European names. Scotches, you've got a lot of difficult to pronounce Scottish names. So you've got Auchentoshan, you've got Lamborghini, you've got, what else have you got? You've got Lafroig. I mean, there are all these names that are hard to pronounce. And so we have this association between something that's a bit different, something that's unique and interesting and luxury based, and being disfluent. So if you want something to seem different and interesting, often disfluency is valuable. Another great example of that is Haagen-Dazs, the ice cream. And so the name Haagen-Dazs has an A with an umlaut on top of it, followed by an A without an umlaut. So it's H-A with an umlaut, A without an umlaut, G-E-N. There is no language in the world that features an A with an umlaut followed by an A without one. But this was a name that was concocted by a man in Brooklyn when he decided that he wanted to introduce a luxury ice cream into the marketplace. So this brand is totally concocted to sound foreign, exotic, vaguely Eastern or Northern European. It's not clear exactly what part of Europe it might be associated with. And so you could really take these ideas, these principles, and apply them to novel examples, novel instances. And there've been some really creative uses. And I think the one that you described, taking the menu and introducing a slightly harder to read font, is exactly the kind of thing that we as people who are producing content for others to consume have at our fingertips when we understand these principles.
I hope you enjoyed this Brainfluence brief. If you didn't, help me out by telling me why in a comment. But if you did find value, please give it a like and don't forget to subscribe. The full episode is available on YouTube and audio outlets like Apple, Spotify, and Google. Visit rogerdooley.com/podcast for a formatted text version plus links and other resources. Thanks for tuning in.